What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome back to The Data Straight, a channel here on YouTube dedicated to translating real-world data into actionable fantasy insights. My name is Reese, a very warm welcome to you, and in today's video, we're going to try and answer how many points would a driver need to score to justify their price tag, and then we're going to use the answer to that question to help us remove some of the noise in the decision-making process going into Singapore. Before we get into the video, I just want to remind everyone that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company Play On that sponsors the game. If it's not already obvious to you from my spreadsheet, I'm a bit of a data nerd and I love Formula One. Formula One is my passion. So I figured, why not try and build a community of other like-minded people here on YouTube? If that sounds good to you, stay tuned to the channel for all sorts of awesome fantasy content. And now we've got that out of the way, let's get into it. Actually, before we get into it, let me just take 60 seconds to set the scene and make reading this chart as easy as Max's overtake on Lewis after the safety car restart in Abu Dhabi. Okay, all you really need to know to understand what this chart is telling you is the function of the line that cuts across the four quadrants and how the driver's position within the quadrants relates to the line. If you think this looks complex, it's not, it's really simple. If a driver is above the line, they are scoring more points than you would expect a driver priced at what they are valued at to score. If they're below the line, they're scoring less than you would expect them to score. And then if they're on the line, the points they're scoring are pretty much fair market value. Just a quick point on the data that's powering this chart. So each of the driver's positions is calculated by dividing the driver's season-long total by their latest price. And then the curve is a logarithmic trend line based off that data set. Because the driver's scores and their price are variable, the driver's placement on the chart and the line itself will change week to week. Essentially, the closer a driver is to the line, the closer that driver's actual score correlates with the fair market value of the points they should have scored. If that doesn't make sense, let's try and bring this to life with a couple of examples. So George is pretty much riding the line. So although he is on the more expensive end, the points he scores are pretty much right on the money, and that's good. If we look at Charles, Charles is above the line. So he's scoring more points than you would expect a driver valued at 20.3 million to score. So that's better. And then if you look at Lewis, you can see that he is just way off the pace. So based on his distance from the line, we can say that Lewis's actual score is not in line with what you would expect a driver that costs 26.5 million to score. And that's bad. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you understand what the line is and how the driver's positions are being calculated. So the question is, how can we use this to our advantage? Well, as I said, any driver below the line is basically underperforming relative to their price point. So we can use this to simplify team selection. We can essentially remove some of the noise because at this point in the season, we can be pretty confident that we don't even need to consider any of the drivers below the line. Now, to be clear, any one of these drivers could pull a blinder, defy the trend and win a race. And you know what? If your gut tells you that, man, 100% this is the week to have Yuki in your team, or if you have a great feeling about Pierre, then by all means, you can add them in. But we're 16 races in now, so we have a good amount of data. And yes, this is Formula One, anything can happen. But just because it can happen doesn't mean it will happen. And as I said, at this point in the season, it's more likely that the drivers will rank in line with the data than deviate from it. Okay, so going into Singapore, who can we exclude? Well, starting in the bottom left, I think we can say that Yuki, Daniel, Zhou and Latifi are out. No ifs, no buts, these four get a hard pass. Then you have Pierre and Seb who get a soft pass. Then you have Valtteri, Lando and Lewis who are all also out of contention. And there's specific reasons for why each of those drivers is out. They're not all excluded for the same reason. And some of them are hard passes, some of them are soft passes, and some of them are good picks. Lewis and Lando are both very consistent drivers, both rated 94% for consistency, but they're just too expensive because of who they are. If we run through the highlights, Yuki is literally rock bottom, and for anyone that watched my last video, you'll know that Yuki is the most inconsistent driver this season, so he is out due to consistency. Just a quick point, if you missed my last upload, feel free to go back and watch it. I ranked all the drivers based on their consistency across the season. Valtteri is actually ranked above the line, but he's in a major downtrend at the moment, so I've marked his original spot with a little dot and then moved him down to account for his current form. Going into Singapore, Valtteri is on a run of -6 points from the last 7 races, and there's a back-to-back P20 in there. The only other drivers to do back-to-back P20s are Zhou and Latifi, so Valtteri is out due to poor performance. Speaking of Latifi, it's worth noting that Latifi is right on the line, so you could argue he should not be excluded because we're not excluding Carlos or George. But given where Alex is, and given the fact that both Haas drivers are super comparable in terms of price, and they're way above where you would expect them to be, I think it's easier to just say Latifi is out. I've also marked Lando as deviating from his actual position because Lando is valued at 15.5 million, and we've only really seen one result this year that justifies that price tag. Talking about Lando, for anyone that hasn't seen, you need to Google his helmet for Singapore. It looks just like the Master Chief helmet from Halo. It is awesome. I did mention this a few videos back, but I'll just say it again. I have a bit of a problem with mini helmets. I really like them. I think they're very cool. So there I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through Reddit, and I saw a picture of it, and I went straight onto his website to see if it was being made into a mini helmet, and well, you know, it is. So now that's on its way. Well, it's not on its way. It won't ship until February, but yeah, that's going to be going on the shelf right between the Mind helmet and the Miami helmet when it finally gets here. Okay, back to the chart, and really onto team selection for Singapore. So my team at Monza was Max, Charles, George, Fernando, Lance, and Haas. I decided to build my team around Max for Monza, but for Singapore, I'm going back to using a constructor as the backbone. So first order of business, I want to get Haas out and put Red Bull in. Red Bull have been on the podium in 94% of the fantasy classifications so far this season, and they've won 50% of them. So I feel good about putting them in. I know the results of free practice 1 and 2 kind of suggest that Red Bull might be lacking some pace going into Singapore, but Max has been quoted as saying he doesn't feel the pace is representative of what the car is capable of. And as much as I would love to see Ferrari repeat the 1-2 from free practice 2 in the race, I just think over the course of 61 laps, Max will do what he's done all season, which is find a way to put his Red Bull on the top spot by the time we see the checkered flag. Okay, so Haas out, Red Bull in, and that uses one substitution, but it puts me way over budget. So, because I'm putting Red Bull in, I'll be taking Max out, and that leaves me 2.6 million to buy a fifth driver, which is obviously not enough. So, it's also going to have to be Alonso out, because from my last video where I did a deep dive on the driver's consistencies, I know that I want to keep George in my team because he's rated 94%, and Fernando is only rated 75%. I'm also confident that I want Charles over Carlos because, comparing their point spreads, I know that Charles has a higher high and a higher low, and he is more consistent than Carlos. So I'm happy to spend a little bit more on Charles because I want him in the mix, which means Fernando gets the chop because that's my only way of clawing back some much needed budget. With Fernando gone, that gives me 14.9 million, which is enough to buy Alex, who, as we can see from the viability matrix, is performing way above what you would expect from a driver valued at 7.7 million. And that will leave me just enough spare to get one of the Haas boys. Now, is including Alex a risk, given Marina Bay is known to be a tough race on the drivers, and Alex of course was replaced by Nick De Vries at Monza due to him having appendicitis? Yes, I think it is a risk, but it's a risk I'm willing to take because watching clips of Alex after FP1, he looks great. He said things went a lot better than expected, and if there was any doubt over his health, he would not be allowed to get behind the wheel. So, is there an actual risk? I think there's a sense that there should be, but I don't think it's material enough to worry about. To be honest with you, the thing I'm more concerned about is how well suited the Williams will be here in Singapore, because we know the Williams is fast in a straight line, but it's not great in the corners, and the cars need a lot of downforce to manage the 23 corners that make up Marina Bay. So, I think more than including Alex, I think the bigger risk is even including Williams at all. But unless I'm going to offload George, which I don't want to do, this is my only option. So Alex is in, and then last but not least, Kevin or Mick. If we come back to the matrix, you can see these two are actually pointing to the same spot, and that's because if we jump into the chart from the last video, you can see just how consistent these two are. Their spread is exactly the same, 25 points. Kevin's range is 1 point higher than Mick's, but that's essentially nothing. They're both scoring within their spread in 69% of the races, and they're essentially the same price. If you only have 6.1 million, then the decision is made for you, right? Because you can't afford Mick. But assuming you can afford both, who do you pick? Honestly, this is where you kind of have to step away from the data because there's literally nothing you can do to separate them. Looking at free practice, Kevin has beaten Mick in both sessions and he currently holds the lap record at Marina Bay, so clearly he knows how to do a fast lap in the streets of Singapore, but Mick is currently driving for his future and that has to count for something, right? Half of me wants to put Kevin in, the other half of me wants to flip a coin. If we look at the points per pound, Kevin is ahead, but Mick has 5 wins to his name. So Mick has been the most cost-efficient driver in 31% of the races so far this season. I'm not necessarily worried about making a wrong decision. It's more about trying to work out which is the more right decision. And the honest answer is I don't know. And I don't really have a strong feeling one way or the other. I think just because of the amount of wins Mick has in the points per pound, I'm going to go with Mick. But my expectation is these two will essentially get the same score. Okay, so that's Charles, George, Alex, Lance and Mick with Red Bull as my constructor. If we jump into the standings, we can see the averages. So that means I'm targeting 28 points for Charles, which will be doubled to 56 because he'll be my turbo driver. 30 points from George, 10 from Lance, 10 from Alex and 7 from Mick. So that's 111 points from my drivers. And then with 61 from Red Bull, that's 174 that I'm targeting for Singapore. Jumping back into the consistency chart, just to sense check myself, the only real risk here is Mick, but Kevin carries the same risk, so that's fine. Alex is at 88%, so I feel good about that. Lance is one of the most consistent drivers, so again, I feel good about that. Same with George, they're both on 94%. And then with Charles, what will be will be. 81% is great. I'm not overly concerned, but we've all seen some of the terrible calls Ferrari have made this year. The memes are out there. And it's not always Ferrari screwing the driver, right? Charles has dumped it into the wall on more than one occasion this year. So what will be will be. I will just say I've got my eye on Sergio. I'm hoping Sergio has a good race this weekend, and I'm hoping to see him go on another tear in the final 6 races, like he did between Austria and Azerbaijan, where he scored 5 podiums in 6 races and averaged 40 points per race. If Sergio does well, I think next week I'll probably look at removing George and putting Sergio in, then using the surplus budget to probably upgrade Lance to Esteban. So yeah, all in all, I feel good about my lineup for Singapore. All my drivers are currently above the trend line. Obviously, that doesn't guarantee me anything, but I feel good about it. I have a solid representation from 6 of the constructors, so there's no concentration risk. And there's 10 beat their teammate in qualifying points up for grabs. Also, between having Red Bull as my constructor and Charles in my team, I feel pretty good about getting the points for pole. I hope this has been useful for you. If you want to listen to a deep dive on the driver's consistencies, you can go back and listen to my last video. If you have any questions or you want to see something specific, pop it in the comments down below and I'll try and address it in a future video. If you're still here, I just want to say a massive thank you for taking some time out of your morning to look at this with me. I really do appreciate it. I wish you luck with your selection. I hope you have a great day ahead and I'll see you again very soon.